And we're in, and the recording has started. So welcome everyone to the first, it says the second for some reason on our website, but it's actually the first of our Islands Matter webinars this semester. There's going to be 3, but it's the first, and I'm very pleased to have Cara here, Cara Ghobhainn Smith from Lewis, who is an educational researcher in Scotland and Canada, and she's based in Balallan in the Isle of Lewis, and she researches, supervises, and writes about, this is it, it's on the website, but it's good to enunciate it, narrative inquiry, participatory research, and compassionate community formation. And she's the organiser of Teaching Through Trauma series on the island, and her latest chapter in Judith McConnell-Farmer's book is Metacognition, New Ways to Think and Learn, which is one of the themes of this webinar, because Cara is going to talk about Hebridean educational research methods and drawing comparisons between them and, I think, Indigenous ways of knowing in Canada. So it's one of the subjects that's dear to our hearts here in Islands Matter, things that set islands apart, which are sort of related to islands, and one of those is, how do islanders know about things? How do they value knowledge? What is the way in which they research things within their community? So we have a good collection of people here listening in. Please feel free, if you have access to the chat, I hope you have access to the chat, you can put some questions there for Cara. And without any further ado, I will pass over to Cara. Hello there, Cara. Nice to see you.
Hello, Martin Bauer, Feskama. Thank you for having me, Andrew. What I'll do is I'll share my screen, and I have a few slides I'll take you through. This is from an educational research perspective. As Andrew mentioned, my own family is from Stornoway and Callanish in Lewis, but I married a Canadian years ago, and French Canadian, and worked in Canada for about 20 years. So it's very much a sort of a hybrid existence for me. But I'll just share my screen here and walk you through some of the methodological issues we grapple with. As we're going through. So you'll be able to see this slide, I hope. And I just have a small screen here, right? So if you have a question or can't see or hear anything, please just unmute yourself and insert yourself into the conversation. So we've been sort of mapping these 2 areas of, and Indigenous in Lewis and Harris, anyway, in the Outer Hebrides, really has a, well, it's a bit of a loaded term, I suppose. It has all kinds of connotations, this Indigenous term. But I suppose as we use it in Gaelic, it's mainly thinking about original sort of land-based community ways of working. And so just taking you through some of these different areas, which I would with my own research students, that idea of, and here we have Hebridean ways of knowing versus Canadian Indigenous ways of knowing. And I have a colleague in Canada who, Elder David Plain from Omshewong, who we often compare these 2 because there are very similar approaches to researching and learning about different issues. So that idea of collectivism over individualism, and I'll talk a bit about this a bit more in a few minutes. That idea of community property over individualism. So even if you think in the larger terms in Scotland, that right to roam, common grazings, if you're a crofter, even just the other day, you know, if someone has extra salmon or lobster or fish or meat from one of the local areas, they'll share it among the houses close to them. And somebody came by with langoustines the other day because, you know, they had caught so many, and so they were sharing them with their neighbors as well. And then there are always certain families within communities that are known for their gifts or their expertise. We're mapping out different walks here in Kinloch, which is Balallan, where I live in Lewis. And there's two elders that know the old names to these various hills and lochs along these old walks. And we just discovered the other day that one of the hills has must have had a historic standing stone on it as a way marker to Callanish, because you can see Callanish from the top of this one hill along the walk, although nobody goes there anymore, and the stone is gone or maybe repurposed. But there are certain people within each community that have that historic, long knowledge. And something that's also really common is your connectedness both to the land and the place, dùthchas and slónach, how you're connected through family ties. And some of this is old knowledge. Some of it is knowledge that I've probably never been anywhere in the world where families know so much about how they're connected to each other and what their ancestral links are than in Lewis and Harris, and it's probably, I don't know, Andrew can attest to this, it's probably very similar in Shetland. I think probably because of clearances, people wanted to keep track of where their families had gone. They wanted to keep those links and those connections, what croft they were from, and so forth. There's also this oral tradition where you're learning from listening. And even if we're trying to get a group, you know, a volunteer group together for work to be done within the community, the work doesn't happen unless people talk to each other in person in advance. And elders play a big role in that. Every community has particular elders that hold, I want to say sacred, but respected place within that community. And usually if decisions are going to be made within the community, someone would speak with that elder as a part of the group. So how does this evolve when you're looking at educational data collection anyway? There's often oral reporting through story. We collected stories about where the original wells were, where people used to draw water from, where the original crofts or townships or villages were before they were moved to the side of the road during clearances. Often, if you're looking for particular specific data, you're looking for peer-nominated participants within the community. So you're looking for that family or those neighbors with story or gifts or recognized expertise within a particular area. And the narrative always comes first by place, that dùthchas, that connection to the land. So the original croft, whose croft it was, what family was on that croft, if you're looking for particular wells, or how they did things along that area. And I think this is really sustainable information that's and data that's critical to sustaining island communities, because it's only through this original knowledge that you know what areas have a tendency to flood, which peatlands are good for burning, some peat isn't very good for fuel or burning, how particular peat beds were restored or maintained, which areas are good for fishing, which areas are good for planting. This is all original knowledge of the land connected with that village and those elders within place. And so a lot of times when you're seeking that participatory research within a particular village or a community, you're genuinely looking for group participation. And I know that a lot of times we'll have, especially lately, we'll have researchers coming to the island with a specific query. They've developed the query on the mainland or in their university or through a grant, completely independent of the community or the area in which they hope to study. And then they'll import the query into the community, into the village, hoping to carry out that one question or those questions without truly developing that particular piece of research with the community, with the group. And if you go back to, you know, that original slide, original communities work as a village, they work as a community. They're not working independently. And that is a really distinct difference between research that we do, you know, within the Outer Hebrides and research that's imported or hoped to be done because of a grant. I'll give you some examples of this. First, where funds and funding is difficult to find, I do empathize, because much of our institutional systems are still based on, you know, a principal investigator. They're still based on a single assignment of a grant. They're not often assigned to a community, to a village in a communal sense. And I'll go into some of those questions later, but this is an example of a piece of research that came to us from a group that was visiting from New Zealand, actually. And what I didn't realize before, and this is one of 5 I've sort of dealt with in the last year, but what I didn't realize is that if an ethics form or approval is approved at an external university, then it's automatically passed through, at least here, through the UHI without much, you know, critical examination. And this was the case for this as well. So the researchers were looking at, they had developed the question outside of the Outer Hebrides, outside of Scotland. They had secured grant funding based on the fact that they were going to come here and collect information. And these were the interview questions that were asked. Now, remember that in our village anyway, in this area of Lewis, people move forward as a group, communally. And so a lot of their questions were based on segregating individuals from the group and asking them about individual knowledge and commenting independently upon actions or knowledge or practices that took place within the village, which people were really uncomfortable with. The other thing, so you can see through this series of interviews how it's all focused on one person, you. Do you understand what is your knowledge? What is your opinion? And if you're approaching data or knowledge as a group from a communal mindset, this feels really uncomfortable and even disrespectful, I suppose. So after we went through some of these things with them, they agreed to move to a small focus group interview with village elders, people that represented the knowledge within that area that had been identified by the village, the place, and they would begin the discussion. And that discussion, that focus group interview, eventually was recorded through narratives, a series of narratives. So the data was extracted. If you think of traditional data being extracted out of those narratives that were shared, so that honoring of that shared voice. So this also connects with some of our sustainable development goals globally. If you think of honoring collaborative partnerships, which is, Global Sustainable Development Goal 7, and then of course, Education 4. And if you think about some of the entrenched colonialism within institutions, sometimes we can think about, what are ways of working that perhaps don't serve us well as researchers any longer. We're often working in research teams, but we're still awarding PhD students and master students individual theses. So if you think of some of these maybe fairly radical questions, such as, can we envision awarding a PhD to a group in the future, or a master's to a group in the future, much like you would award a Nobel to a research group? And then if you think about that shared knowledge, where a lot of it, promotions, money, funding, is all about ownership. Who owns that knowledge, rather than this shared knowledge that we all own the knowledge. It's not one person's data. It's not one person's analytical conclusions. These are just questions that we're grappling with, I suppose. And then that recognition of that diversity of knowledge, for example. Something my own students are just completing is that fellowship in advanced HE and higher education. And one thing that one thing that they're struggling with is the forms all require first person. Whereas if you're teaching, or if you're working within a community, or you're working in a research group, there's almost nothing you do honestly on your own. You're always working in, as a community, as a group. You're learning together. You're sharing, you know, what you found and contributing to those findings. So that's a really big difference between, you know, thinking about Indigenous approaches and methods of researching versus what we're commonly engaged in. Just raises more questions probably than answers, but it's just an overview of what we're working through at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed, Cara. Yes, it raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? And it's very eye-opening as well. So please, everyone, if you've got questions or comments or ways you'd like the discussion to go, just stick them in the chat, and we'll follow up on that. Just a few things. First of all, you mentioned Shetland, Cara, and well, there is a tradition of reading the kin that people do, that they try and work out who's who and where everybody fits into the community. Perhaps not so common now because there's a lot of people coming into Shetland like myself that have lived for many years, but we don't fit into the old pattern, as it were. But it's definitely still a tradition. People like to be able to point out who is who and how they fit in. People, family tree research is a huge thing in Shetland as well. There's a wonderful website that provides tons of information, and people are very interested in combining their information and being part of that. And in the past, there was a record of a man in the 18th century who could, tell his kin back 11 generations. It was part of his. And it was also part of landowning as well. You had to be able to identify your connection to the first person who took the land, so the Udal law system. So there's a similarity there. And also, I saw that you had you sort of identified Lewis elders as people who take part in the sort of local history organisations, and local histories groups, very rich tradition of that in Shetland as well. All the communities here have their local history groups, and it tends to be people, over 35 who are part of that and are extremely interested in their local history.
Yeah, and I suppose if someone is looking to connect to a village or a particular community or a particular area, it's the Comanachtree that really sort of drive those snowball participant connections that researchers may be searching for.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, we're doing a bit of research into the importance of cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, in Shetland for maintaining the population and for making people want to come back and live in Shetland because of the rich heritage. So the local history groups are part of that. Thanks, Carrie. You put the comment there in the chat. There's a comment here from Bernadette. The question's valid. How do we acknowledge other knowledge in a thesis as the candidate doesn't have ownership? So we move away from extractivism. So yeah, how do we?
Yeah, and I think that's that is a big question. And I know Bobby Macaulay was speaking, and he will be speaking, and he was speaking a couple of weeks ago about ethics and how, besides traditional informed consent, thinking about what queries, what questions are actually needed within a particular community, but also I think this underpins that idea of honoring voice. So honoring that, collecting that other knowledge, Bernadette, but also returning to the origin of that knowledge and verifying, this is what I've written, this is what I've understood it to mean. Do you think this is correct? Or do you think this accurately depicts, portrays the phenomenon, or what's happening within this particular place and time? Or is this, or does this voice need to change? So taking that extra step, which sometimes I know is challenging, to go back and revisit and secure that that evidence that you've collected, so that you're genuinely honoring that data, those voices, I suppose. And I know there's other researchers here too that
There are. Mm-hmm.
do qualitative. Any other comments on ownership?
While people put their comments in chat or hold up their hands, I was just wondering, you mentioned that Indigenous is a kind of a loaded term in the Hebrides. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and we've been really grappling with this. I think it has roots in colonization as well. So it does, as a word, it does accurately describe original knowledge. So original place-based knowledge within an area, within a community, within a village. But to describe someone as Indigenous, which I think is a fairly accurate term, but I know there are older, elders, and, I have an auntie, and she would really reject that idea of being called Indigenous. And I think its place, the word, is based in racist roots. So for people still, so when they think of someone Indigenous, they think that you're moving into discussions of race, someone who's, and we have all sorts of narrative and referenced, citations describing islanders as black-faced natives, really derogatory terms with regard to people that have settled and lived here for thousands of years. And I think that word, you really have to unpack some of that history along with it, and rethink it, reclaim it, maybe. But the word itself is such a powerful call to who are we? Where are we? What do we represent?
And yes, yeah, I know there's it can have a pejorative sense, but it also implies certain rights as well, doesn't it? You're sort of, you are of and belong to the place in a way that others don't.
Yeah, and that's another issue. Is it exclusionary as well? I mean, we often, you've probably heard of, the Gaelic Mafia, or other, how are we a diverse community? Are we including those who have moved and settled here more recently? Is that a part of our narrative in the islands as well? this crosses a lot of different fields, of course, not just educational research, but other social sciences and work being done as well. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. It ties into the term dùthchas, which you mentioned.
Yes, that's right.
Maybe you could expand a little bit more on the meaning of dùthchas as well for everyone.
Yeah, that connection to, I'm just in the middle of writing a series on it, but that connection of one's, like a bird migrating home or a bat migrating thousands of miles back to that innate place. Dùthchas is one's connection with where they live, their land, their craft, that identity found through land-based place. So it's that intersection of land and identity, and which is something I think we can all really identify with. It's always been really difficult for myself and my children, I suppose, because we're when you come from two different countries, sometimes you feel as if you never really belong to either place, and working out where you belong, how that's connected to the land and where you are, is huge. It's something, a really, really intimate tie to people, I think.
Thank you. Now Bernadette's got a message in chat, if you can see that.
Yeah. She says self-identity or self-identify as traditional knowledge holders and not Indigenous. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Culture is highly contested. Yes. Yeah, and right to culture. Yeah, you're right. It's I suppose as a species where people are messy. There's no one's experience mirrors another's, and yeah, unpacking that is well, it's part of the joy of research too, trying to understand and connect with how others view and perceive knowledge, and where you are is a big part of what we do as researchers, really.
I see Laurie is trying to type something in as well, but it doesn't seem to be coming through. Now, Laurie's based in Prince Edward Island, so it takes us over to Canada. Can you tell us a bit about some of the connections to researching Indigenous knowledge in Canada?
It is Canada, or a colleague that I have at Omshimong that I work with, David Plain. He's it's interesting because some of the colonization happened maybe 200 years later than in the Outer Hebrides. So we're looking at you know, issues that have are very, very similar. Communities that work with very similar hierarchies, very similar communal structures and forms of, I say education and learning, but it's really ways of knowing. So if you're in education, there's formal education as we understand it, you know, today traditionally classrooms, students, desks, a hierarchy, and there's non-formal learning and informal learning which happens outside of that traditional formal course or module, but informal learning where you set out to learn something, but it's not by enrolling in a course or an institution necessarily. It's you're setting out to learn something from a neighbor or a family member or a community member, and or even if you think of it, I suppose, digitally online through YouTube or a search for something, and you're learning it informally that way. You set out to learn it, you're learning it through a different method. And then you have non-formal education, which is that you didn't set out with a question or to learn something specific, but through your daily life, through living, you have learned, you've acquired information or a skill, regardless of having set out to learn it. Paul Mayan, he's a Gaelmerd. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I have seen his name. I haven't met him though. And Laura, PEI. Let's see.
Yeah, so Laurie is looking at, well, she's been doing research into the role of belonging and well-being and how that contribute to vital communities. And well, Laurie runs the Institute for Island Studies in PEI. So the concepts of islander and islandness are very important, but islander itself seems to be exclusionary. So looking at ways of stories that can demonstrate how we can make islands a more inclusive place of everyone who lives there.
Yeah.
So
thanks, Andrew. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think if you're involved in community research, group exclusion has long been an issue, and I suppose the roots of that go back to social science, don't they? Why do people exclude and include particular people within their group? I don't think it's particular to islanders, but necessarily, but you see this maybe in Glasgow, or you might see it in areas of the borders, or you might see it in Northern England. If you have a particular accent or you speak a particular form of the language, even in Gaelic circles here, there's a hierarchy to accents in Gaelic. Most of us consider, the Stornoway accent is quite different from Uist, and Uist is sort of considered the standard for Gaelic, whereas people from the southern Outer Hebrides regard the Stornoway accent when they hear it on the news as rather probably the equivalent of using the Queen's English as opposed to, the everyday variety of accents you'd come across Scotland and England. So I think group exclusion is something that you find wherever you go. The question is, does it sustain and support the group or community, including incomers, or is it something that is detrimental to the group and community as a whole? Yeah, these are social science, big social science questions, I think, belonging. I just had a PhD student who finished an educational thesis on belonging, Anita Tarani, and she lives in Germany, and she had emigrated from Hungary during the wars to Germany, to the United States, and then to Canada, and then back to Germany, always for work in different circumstances. But she documented each time she emigrated and what her pathway to feeling like she genuinely belonged as a part of the community was. And I'll put her reference because she has a book coming out next year, but she found there were two key components. One was employment. If she felt she was contributing to the community, she was a part of the economic force of the community. And the second one was there was one significant mentor or community member that sort of championed or made a connection with her when she arrived. I think that belonging piece is a big issue in society right now. How do we feel that we belong? Where do we belong? Dùthchas again. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, sort of carrying on a little bit, it was interesting when you showed the New Zealand research questions. So I take it this wasn't from, well, people with a connection to the Maori community. This was purely, I don't know what you call it, Western academic style research.
Yeah, they had, I think one of the researchers did actually have a connection, but they had secured funding and were, as I put it, importing a query or piece of research into a community that they hadn't spoken with before, hadn't made connections with prior. And so I think that's an important distinction. And that used to happen all the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have hundreds of years of writings where people would come to the islands, they would write about the people in the islands without ever speaking to the people in the islands. I think we're a little bit more progressive now, but this approach, and I know there is a tension because on the one hand, your employment, your funding depends on you securing research on producing outcomes. But it is a very different mindset from a communal mindset. And I think when you're researching within communities, within participatory settings, that early connection over time, before grants, before funding, before something happens, needs to occur, and it takes time. It's not quick, but I think in the end it does make for a better, stronger piece of respected research.
Well, I agree, and that's something the role that UHI can play, being maybe the academic person that the academic world outside can contact to be then introduced to the community. That's what we try and do here anyway in Orkney and Shetland. We try and provide that. We don't get annoyed, but we're surprised sometimes that the research that's being undertaken in subjects that we have expertise in the islands is just being done by somebody else who didn't realize that we existed or didn't think to contact us. Not that we necessarily want to stop people doing the research, but we could be a useful sort of component in it, and we could help them to, meet people in the community that would be useful to them. So I think UHI has quite an important role. And if you like yourself are exploring old ways of research, traditional ways of research, then it even makes it even more important that people contact people like yourself and us, Northern Ireland.
I know I had a colleague raise that question And maybe it's a question we should ask. You know, is data mining the new colonization? Are we removing information and knowledge just as, you know, lairds long ago would remove people for sheep, or, you know, mine across areas that has to do with land, but is knowledge a form of one's land, one's dùthchas? Is that, do you have a right to your own knowledge within your own area? I don't know. It's an interesting question.
It is.
Yeah.
There's certainly a debate to be had there. There was just well, there's a couple of other things I'd like to bring up, but just sort of a daft one. I think it was in the New Zealand questionnaire, and there was in brackets fishman. What on earth, fishman?
Oh, let me see. Let me go back to that. Oh, right. Yes. Okay. Here, let me just share my screen again. That's Joshua Fishman.
Oh, see, I thought it was a folklore being or something.
No. Yeah. So I'll just put that in the chat here for you.
I've heard of
right. No,
selfies,
that's
but
right.
not fishmen.
Joshua. Yeah, sorry, I just copied and pasted that there. That's Joshua Fishman. He was a researcher, probably, I'm going to say about 20, 30 years ago. I would have educational and language researchers often use his framework. And he had a framework of, you know, language maintenance, essentially. And it does have to do with sustainability. So if you work within sustainability, even though his framework is directed at language transmission, I think it's equally applicable to a lot of forms of knowledge, language being only one of them. So his key idea that we were looking at it for Gaelic language, but his key idea was that if a language was no longer being transmitted or passed on intergenerationally in the home, in families, in the community, then it was at risk of extinction. And I think a lot of knowledge, you know, at least original knowledge within an area where floodplains are, where clean water is, where the soil is good for growth, where the soil has is good for fuel. That's original knowledge of an area, of a land, that if it's not passed on, if it's not collected, if it's not exchanged through KE, as we would say today, then it is at risk of being lost. And we can see areas where that knowledge has been lost long ago. We have 12 sets of Callanish standing stones, you know, as you would across Shetland and Orkney, of course. But we no longer, because of the influence of various Christian religious groups over the last 200 years, we no longer know what the purpose of those stones were. I'm sure there was original knowledge there at some point. This is what this place used to be used for. These were the way markers for, you know, pilgrimage to this area or a route to this area. But we don't have that knowledge anymore. It's long been lost because it wasn't transmitted. And that was part of Joshua Fishman's intergenerational theory.
Right, very good, interesting. Oh well, that's folklore being that I will now score out. Yeah, okay, yeah, traditional knowledge is vital. There's been lots lost in Shetland too, but there's lots still to be recorded. That's the thing. We have to actually get out and meet communities and record this material so it can be passed on. Because the trouble is, I don't know if it's the same in Lewis, but it's sometimes at the moment it's not being passed on because the young generation are not that interested in it. So we have a problem of intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Sorry, yeah. There was just, well, and the final thing that I want to bring up, but there's some other nice, interesting comments in the chat there. Sarah's got one about braiding sweetgrass and about becoming Indigenous, which looks very interesting. I was just, I want to pick your brains a little bit more about your idea of a group PhD, because as we all know, those who have PhDs, it's like a reward for the enormous amount of work that you have to put in to get it, as much as the research behind it. So how would that work for a community? Who would do the work and sort of, who would be responsible for it in a way? So surely you're not just throwing that out as a kind of wild idea for us to go, ooh, that's a wild idea. Have you got sort of examples or thoughts about that?
I know, and this is a really difficult question, isn't it? I think it evolves out of the idea that we work as research teams. So if you're in the sciences, for example, anybody within that lab publishes on the paper for that lab, or a particular lab. But it's really difficult to approach this question at all from our own perspective. And I don't know how much of I was raised and came through a work system that rewarded the individual. So I apply for a job as an individual. I secure funding as a PI with a team. I am expected I. It's very individual, and even asking that question, we're assuming that other people don't do as much work. So even asking that question, we want to, we're not perceiving it as a group. We're assuming that the work can be divided up in neat little segregated boxes, and that if you contribute, I don't know, 500 grams of this work, you will be within, I don't know, level 12 in line for reward within this group. But yeah, I'm not even sure that within our current administrative and institutional processes that we would be capable of assessing something like this. I know that, if you think of research groups who have been awarded Nobels, for example, I don't know whose name went on the application for the Nobel. Do they have to acquire so much? I mean, it's a really difficult question, isn't it? How much is enough? And I'm not sure that that's a question that a group working communally would even ask. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, I don't know. It's just a sort of an interesting idea. I can't see it myself, but some form of acknowledgement from the academic world that a community has done some great work in doing their own research and preserving their culture seems a great idea. Sort of a sort of I don't know, some sort of prize like the Nobel, but Yeah, who would be the doctor? Would it be common Echrinish or what? You know,
Who's awarded the? Well, that's exactly it, isn't it? I mean, we're yeah, we're not set up to, and we have copyrights and ownership of particular. I think ownership is the key. What do we own? Should we own? These are very socialist questions, I suppose, in a way. So there's something from Graham Bell here.
yes. There's a bit of a conversation going on about the Faroe Islands in the
Yes,
chat.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. I'm surprised to hear that too, Graham. Yes, exactly. Yeah. That is an interesting story, how things change. Yeah, especially in Ukraine. Yeah, I suppose we all worry about Ukraine at the moment.
And Erica from the University of the Faroe Islands has been doing research into participation and non-participation in Faroese culture, and
Yes.
whether there's a kind of a barrier to people taking part if they don't speak Faroese. And Pat is actually in the Faroe. Well, Erica's in the Faroes as well, University of the Faroes, but Pat is living in the Faroes as well, and she's been experiencing firsthand the sort of difficulties. But it sounds as if she is getting there, as it were. But these it wouldn't be immediate. I mean, somebody coming into Balallan, Cara, how long would it take for them to become sort of part of the, not just part of the community, but part of the culture, the heritage, to be engaged with dùthchas and things? Is it 6 generations, or would it happen in a decade?
That's a good question. How do we measure time? And Erica, thank you so much for those references. For those of you monitoring the chat, there's some really good links to Erica's papers there, and to braiding sweetgrass from earlier, and Sarah. Trying to keep up in this. Oh yeah, yeah. Knitting and storytelling too. That's great. All right. Let's see. You know, we have. I know there is a man who lives just up the road from me, and he's a Lusach, but not from Balallan. He's from South Lochs, and he married a Lochie, so he lives in Balallan now. But he worked. No, his father worked in Africa for a time, I think 10 years. So when he moved to Balallan, everyone called him Ian Africa. And for those of you in Lewis, you might know him. And he's been here for 50 years now, and people still call him Ian Africa. Even though he himself was never in Africa. He was never outside of Lewis, but he's been in Balallan for 50 years, married to a Lusach, and he's still called Ian Africa. So I don't know if that answers your question, Andrew, but I'd say maybe 2 generations or so.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. Well, I think we're just about rounding it up now. But just before we go, Sarah was wondering if you could say again the name of the writer who's belonging through contribution, employment, and a key mentor with the forthcoming book.
Oh yes, sorry, that's Anita. I'll see if I can find a reference for her as well, and put it in the chat here for you. her PhD was.
And while Cara does that, just to remind folk, there's another 2 Islands Matter webinars coming up before Christmas, and there are also 2 Faroes Shetland Research Symposia as well, the first of which is tomorrow. So hopefully you can see some people, some of you at that as well. And we will also be running a Yarns and Yarns University of the Arctic webinar in early December as well, which links peoples and cultures and knitting and talking all together in one neat package. So look out for that too.
Yeah, I love that. That's fantastic. Magariru.
So there we go. There's that 3rd of December. Yeah, it's coming from PEI this time. So thanks very much indeed, Cara. Very thought-provoking. Lots of things to take away and ponder from what you were saying, and for sort of taking us deeper into traditional ways of knowing and researching, things that we can, lessons we can take away when we're doing our own research and wanted to interact with communities in the islands, and also just drawing that close connection between communities in Lewis and also communities in Canada as well. I think that's important, and also the fact that it's created discussion in the chat about the Faroe Islands and as well. So very interesting indeed. So thank you very much, Cara, and thank you very much everyone for coming to this webinar over your lunchtime, and hope to see you again soon in further events. But Cara, let's keep in touch. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Andrew. Cheers. Bye. Bye.